to The Book of Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. Queen of the Jews is Judy Petsonk's historical novel about Queen Salome Alexandra, a descendant of the Maccabees who ruled the independent nation of Judea. I spoke to Judy when she visited my own synagogue, Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, to give a presentation for the book lovers in our community. Judy Petsonk, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us briefly about your book, Queen of the Jews.
The Queen of the Jews was named Salome Alexandra. Shalom Tzion. She was a real woman who was married to a grandson of Simon Maccabee and ruled Judea in the 1st century BCE. Her husband was a violent soldier and alcoholic who hated the rabbis and tried to exterminate them. The rabbinic movement was just in its infancy, and she saved them, brought them back, and reestablished their authority in the Sanhedrin and gave them a chance to become the teachers of the Jewish people.
Wow, that sounds very exciting and dramatic. How did you first learn about how do you say her name?
Salome Alexandra.
Salome Alexandra.
But Jewish people called her Shalom Tzion.
Shalom Tzion. How did you first learn about her?
I was walking down the street in Jerusalem. I was a tourist, and I come to this sign, Queen Shalom Tzion Street, and a Jewish queen who was not named Esther. I just had to find out more about her. I was busy when I got back raising kids, but finally I got around to researching her story, which is told by the historian Josephus, who lived about 100 years later.
So this was in the works for a long time then?
It was in my head for a long time, and it took about 7 years to complete.
So the reviews, I've noticed, consistently praise your solid research, and it sounds like you probably had to do a lot of research. Tell a little bit about that process, and maybe what were some of the most exciting or interesting things you found out.
There were 3 kinds of information. My book is a historical novel. It turns out that there's very little information. There's Josephus's story, and he didn't like the idea of a woman exercising power. Shalom Tzion ruled for 9 years on her own after her husband died. And he said she took so much control that men forgot how to rule, and that's why the Romans conquered Judea. So I thought the story needed to be told from another perspective, and you can mine Josephus's story, as I did, for lots of evidence about what she was really like. In addition, there are tales in the Talmud, very brief anecdotes, but pieces of the puzzle. And recently there's been archaeological excavations. I did not know, and maybe a lot of American Jews don't even realize, that after 25 years of war, the last surviving Maccabee succeeded in establishing an independent kingdom. That was Simon. I didn't even know there was an independent kingdom 2,000 years ago, but they have palaces and forts. Herod built on top of a lot of them, but you can still walk around and see the swimming pools and the gardens and the mikvahs. She was very pious and built mikvahs all over Judea. So put all those things together and read between the lines of Josephus, and that's how I figured out who she was, what she did, and why I'd never heard of her.
Wow. And were there any interesting details you found out about in the research that you weren't able to use in the book?
There are lots. For one, I sneaked through the checkpoint into the Palestinian territories and got to walk on one of the mosaic floors that she had constructed. But it just didn't fit in with the story. I figured from another anecdote that her husband, Alexander Jannaeus, although a very good soldier, was illiterate, because there's a story in which he gets a delegation from Parthia, and he doesn't know what to do with them. He's not comfortable in a situation in which he has to act like a diplomat. So he says to Salome, bring back your brother so he could say the prayers and we can get some food. And she says, well, you promise you won't hurt him. I mean, he's in hiding because her husband hated her brother. But I gathered from that, first of all, some things about the relationship between the queen, her husband, and her brother, but also that this king, who was also the high priest, didn't even know the blessings over food. And then, of course, when her brother gets there, what does he say? But, Lord, bless the food that King Yanai has eaten, because he wasn't offered any. And, and of course, this only makes the relationship between them that much worse.
Right. Wow.
So there were lots of little gems like that. I had to make the story unfold, so a lot of these cool things had to go by the wayside.
Right, that's why I thought maybe you could tell them now. What makes Salome and what makes this period of history important for modern readers to know about?
Well, although we had one god and Greeks had many, the whole Mediterranean basin all had the same way of worshiping. That is, there were priests, there were temples, and there were sacrifices on the altar. Because the Syrian king had brought idols into the temple, and because the priests were collaborating with the Hellenizers, the people of Judea were very disillusioned, and that's why they followed the Maccabees. And that was the beginning of a huge transformation in Judaism, because instead of having to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year and bring goats along, we now can go study in our local synagogues, celebrate the holidays in our homes and communities, because Rabbinic Judaism took over, a religion of teachers and students and personal responsibility. You didn't have to go to the priest to make up for your sins. You could just try to do better, and make a new resolution at Yom Kippur every year. So it became a very different religion, and because of that, it was the founding religion for all of the monotheistic religions of the West, including Christianity and Islam and modern Judaism.
So this was the turning point.
This was the turning point, right, from a sort of still biblical, even though it was post-biblical, but temple-centered religion to a religion of communities, dispersed and can travel anywhere in the world.
You've written several nonfiction books, guides to Jewish life of various kinds. Was that experience relevant to novel writing, or were you really starting fresh?
Well, you have to understand that just writing nonfiction was a starting over, because I had been a newspaper reporter. And, in a newspaper story, you say the most important thing in the first line, and then everything else is an expansion of that. Mm-hmm. And so writing nonfiction, and particularly the kind of nonfiction I wrote, was much more personal, much more conversational, a very different style, and it took me a while to learn that style. My first book was the Intermarriage Handbook, a guide for Jews and Christians, and that was a family dynamics kind of book that looked at the decisions people make. So we acted like journalists. We interviewed people, and then we put all their stories together. The second book was called Taking Judaism Personally, and it was about the 60s generation and the succeeding generations. I'm part of the 60s generation, and how they went away from their Jewish roots and came back with things they had learned, with feminism, with mysticism, with all the things they learned on their various spiritual journeys. This book, I kind of had to interview my imagination, because I had these facts, and what I had to say was, what's the relationship between all these characters? How did Salome stay married to a man who was her polar opposite, politically, emotionally, and physically? How did she stay married to him for 27 years? She was a pretty powerful woman, so how did she keep from getting her head cut off? And since I had, in my previous life, studied a lot of family dynamics, I tried to understand them as a psychologist would understand them, which, of course, Josephus that wasn't what he was trying to do.
Very cool. Would you like to read a brief passage?
Okay. Shalomcion's first husband died after 1 year of ruling, so she had a difficult choice to make. If she wanted to stay queen, which history suggests she did, she had to marry the next living brother. 3 problems. First, he was 15 years younger than she was. She was 37, quite old for a woman at that time, and she'd never had any children. He was 22, and a very randy 22. He liked to be surrounded by his prostitutes and camp followers. Second, he hated the rabbis. She was the leading advocate for the rabbis in a palace that was otherwise pro-Greek and Hellenistic. So they were political opposites. But the third and most difficult reason is that he was in jail, and she was probably the one who had put him there, feeling that he would be a threat to her first wimpy husband. So this is the scene in which they get engaged. The stairwell to the dungeon was dark. It smelled of mildew. "Alexander Judæus," said my guard, "stand. Her Royal Highness Salome Alexandra, Queen of Judea, wishes to speak with you." "What a surprise," said Yanai, rising slowly to his feet. "The Holy Queen has descended into the pit to greet the viper." He gestured around the bare stone cell. "Please excuse my surroundings, Your Highness. I wish I could offer you a chair." I ignored his sarcasm. I'd made my choice. "I'm going to release you from prison," I said, "and crown you king." "How kind of you," said Yanai, "but only if you accept my terms," I added. "You're the queen. I'm the prisoner. What are the terms?" "I will remain queen. In fact, not only in title. You will be called king and high priest, but I will rule the land of Judea." Yanai snorted. "You are tough. Is that all your terms?" "One more. You must marry me and give me children." "You want me to marry you, old woman?" said Yanai. "You think you can still bear children?" "Children should be no problem," I said. "I'm not sure I can bear you."
Awesome. You've done a lot of speaking engagements to promote Queen of the Jews. Is there a question nobody ever asks that you'd like to be asked?
Well, I don't necessarily want to be asked, but one question that I'm prepared to answer that nobody asks is, why did you spend 7 years of your life trying to write this book? And the answer is, I identify with this queen in lots of ways. First of all, women need to know about Jewish heroines. We don't have so many real Jewish heroines from the past. The fact is that Esther was fiction. And as far as I'm concerned, she wasn't a terrific model. I don't want to have to get my authority and my influence from winning a beauty contest, now or long ago. But the idea that there was a woman in a time when ruling a country meant just stripping it of its resources, taxing the people to death, and living high, she actually tried to govern. She extended the walls of Jerusalem. She built an aqueduct so the city would be safe from siege. And she built mikveh pools, which meant that she cared that the people remained loyal to the Jewish religion. So she was really trying to be a leader when this was the age of the Cleopatras. It was the age of bling. It was a violent age, a sex-obsessed age, and she was trying to tread the balance between being a moral person and ruling a country, which are not two things that are always compatible. I think it's especially important to remember her at Hanukkah because we tend to think the Maccabee story ended with the rededication of the temple. The fact is that that war went on for 25 years. It was a civil war between people who wanted to collaborate with the Greeks, including most of the priests, and people who wanted to preserve Judaism. And the descendants of the Maccabees were not on the side of the people who wanted to preserve Judaism. They were on the side of the people who wanted to collaborate with the Greeks. So Shalom Zion was kind of alone in the palace, trying to save the very early fledgling rabbinic movement. I would like to think that when we light the shamash, the candle that lights all the other candles, we'll say some kind of praise of Shalom Zion, because she was the candle that lit all the other candles and kept the Maccabee flame alive when their own sons and grandsons and great-grandsons did not.
Good answer. Judy Petsonk, thank you for talking with us.
Thank you very much.
There are so many ways to connect with the Book of Life. Fan us at facebook.com/Book of Life Podcast. Follow us at twitter.com/Book of Life Pod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. You can also listen to the latest episode by phone at 916-313-3820. And of course, find links to everything at bookoflifepodcast.com. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org, and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band at freilachmakers.com. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.